To God be the glory.
Yom Tov, Talmudim. Good day, students. Ma Shalom Ka. How are you? My name is Dr. Dennis Petrillo, and we're ready to start lesson number 2. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about the Hebrew language and give some background information that will be helpful so that you can understand this language a little bit more and understand its history and a little bit of its significance. Hebrew belongs to a great family of closely allied languages known as Semitic languages, spread throughout Western Asia, including Arabia and Northern Africa. The word Semitic is derived from the word Shem, the name of one of course, Noah's sons in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 10. It's really a convenient rather than a scientific term that's been adopted by scholars, and of course it's been used for years now. Other Semitic languages have been discovered during the last 100 years as archaeologists continue to find new sites in which to dig on and come up with all sorts of discoveries, such as Akkadian is also a Semitic language. It's a common name for Assyrian and Babylonian, Akkadian is. Also Ugaritic, which is akin to Hebrew and is very important for biblical research and understanding Ugaritic. A basic knowledge of Semitic languages is very important for the mastery of and research for Hebrew. Many peculiarities and grammatical forms in one Semitic language can often be explained only by an analogy with other Semitic languages in which there are a number of branches, 5 main branches. That is Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, Akkadian, and Ethiopic. Now let's look at this particular chart, which in your textbooks is on page number 7, chart of Semitic languages. Now you can see by looking at this particular chart that there is a main distribution. Now of all of the various Semitic languages, only Hebrew and Arabic are spoken today, which is kind of interesting. And so a number of these languages, which we'll be talking about in just a moment, were dead languages at one point. The principal peculiarities of Semitic languages have the various following things in common. They have what's called guttural letters that have special sounds that basically have to do with the passage of air through the throat. And some of these guttural letters and the sounds that they make are very difficult for English-speaking people to make because we have no sounds like that in English, and so you're going to have to work on some of the pronunciation of these. They have the 3 root letters for almost all verbs and nouns, and we talked about that. We called it the triliteral root. Remember that? It has 3 letters, and everything is based on those 3 letters, adding stuff to the front and adding stuff to the back. The triliteral root. These are all things that are common to Semitic languages. Also, the meaning is dependent on the form or pattern of words. The word order in Hebrew, like in Greek, is very significant. It helps establish who is the subject and who is the direct object, who's receiving the action of the verb. And so those are things that you're going to need to be familiar with, but that's common to Semitic languages. And then pronominal suffixes to nouns and verbs and prepositions. We'd like to add things to words. And you might say, oh boy, that's what makes it all that much harder, but actually it makes it that much easier because in Hebrew there's really not all that much that we're going to be able to add to the front of a word or that much that we'll be able to add to the back of a word. And so as a result, we find that triliteral root, we find those 3 letters, and we understand what thing can go on the front of that and what things can go on the back of that, and that'll make it a lot easier. And as a result, by knowing and having this basic vocabulary, that's what enables you to expand that vocabulary, understand a lot of different words, just because you learned one word of the triliteral root. All right, when we go back to the chart here and we look at this, here are some of the features of the Semitic languages that's listed here on this particular table. Now we go to the Western, and what is, as you can see, following the line down to the Northwest group. There are basically 4 of those, of which Hebrew was one. Hebrew is very closely related to the Canaanite language, and we found glosses on cuneiform tablets that have been found in Tel El Amarna in Upper Egypt. You may have heard of the Tel El Amarna tablets, date about 1400 BC, and so very old, and date approximately during the time of Moses. And so here we can see, by looking at the Tel El Amarna tablets, the writing that happened about the time of Moses. Moabite is also another one of the languages that is common to Hebrew. The famous King Mesha inscription, which is 9th century BC, and so dates about the time of Solomon. A little after that, that's also a very important discovery. Phoenician, or you see there Canaanite Phoenician, is known from inscriptions of the 9th century BC. And then also Ugaritic, a language that's very closely related to Biblical Hebrew and written in ancient cuneiform, but an alphabetic script, and that makes that very significant for us. The discovery was accidentally made by an Arab farmer in Ras Shamra, a North Syrian coastal city known in ancient times as Ugarit. Now, hundreds of tablets so far that have been deciphered have added much to knowledge of Canaanite culture and religion and to biblical studies, and have revealed striking parallels with other ancient religious poetry and observances. We call this cognate languages. We're studying a Hebrew word, and perhaps we don't fully have an understanding of what this Hebrew word means. Well, what we can do is we can go to what's called a cognate language. For example, we're talking a little bit about this Ugaritic language. Let's say, for example, we have a word in the book of Job. Job is an Old Testament book that has lots of words that occur nowhere else in the Hebrew Old Testament. And as a result, if you're reading some of the older translations, such as the King James or the Revised Standard, you'll have a marginal reading that will give you a definition that is far different than what they may have put in the text. And they may also say that this is the only time this particular word occurs in the Hebrew Old Testament, and that adds to the difficulty of studying. However, these recent discoveries in the Ugaritic tablets have been one of those that, because it has parallels to Hebrew, we find these cognate or similar words, and as a result of those similar words, we're able to understand better what the text is actually saying. And that's one of the advantages of newer translations that take into consideration these more recent discoveries, especially in Old Testament study. Now, during the biblical period, the language spoken by the Israelites was called in the Bible the land of Canaan in Isaiah 19 and verse 18. It's very similar to other Canaanite-speaking nations that we've already talked about. Hebrew was a living language used for speech and for writing by the Israelites until the Babylonian exile in 606 to 586 BC. Now, you'll recall from your Old Testament study that the northern tribes were taken into captivity in 722 BC, and then the southern tribes were taken into Babylonian captivity in 606. Now, when that happened and they were carried off into exile to Babylon, then that is the time that they began to speak and learn the language that was spoken by the Babylonians, which was Aramaic. And so the political and the cultural language of the Near East gradually replaced Hebrew from about the 6th century BC, and that's the beginning of the death of Hebrew, when Hebrew began to die out. And probably by the 1st century AD, Hebrew was no longer the dominant language. Probably in the New Testament, the main language spoken by the common people was Aramaic, and then there would be those that would know and understand Greek, and then there would be those who, because of special education, or they had a leaning toward or a tendency to become a religious teacher or active in the synagogue in some way, then they would have had the benefit of studying and learning Hebrew. So it is very likely that Hebrew may have been spoken by several communities and individuals for several centuries later, but it certainly wasn't the predominant language of the New Testament. Hebrew was used throughout the centuries as a vehicle for important theological and philosophical writings, as well as for secular and scientific works in the field of poetry and astronomy and medicine. And finally, in the present century, Considerable efforts stemming from the Zionist colonization of Palestine and led and inspired by a man by the name of Eliezer ben Yehuda, who lived in 1858 through 1922, were made to revive the language. And that's when the language really came back to life, whereas because of the Babylonian exile it had died and had been pretty much a dormant language for all those centuries. So it is the only known revival of a dead language in the history of nations. So Hebrew has a special place in that it was at one point a dead language and then it was revived again. Today in Israel, all subjects from history to physics and medicine are taught in Hebrew. That's why if you visit over there today, you'll be able to see Hebrew all over the place, and the Hebrew that you read today is very akin to the biblical Hebrew that we're studying in this class. Hebrew is the language not only of kindergartens and schools and colleges, universities, but also the press, the radio, television. They speak Hebrew, and that's the language that is now the predominant language of Israel. There are four main phases of the Hebrew language. We're looking at the bottom part of the chart here, going to the western part of the Hebrew language. We have Biblical Hebrew, which is known also as Classical Hebrew. If you're looking at Weingren's text, you need to understand that Classical and Hebrew is also that which he's talking about. Rabbinical Hebrew, or late Hebrew, which is in the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is 2nd century A.D. writing. The Hebrew portions in the Talmud and Midrash were written at that time. And then we have what is called medieval or rabbinic Hebrew, the Hebrew of the great theological, philosophical, and poetical works composed during the Middle Ages, mainly in Spain and North Africa, and also the language of the translations from Arabic and the works written under the influence of the Arabic language. During the Middle Ages, it served as the language of study for the Jews throughout the world. And then, of course, we have modern Hebrew, the development of which has begun in the present century and is now developing and, of course, has a revived interest all over the world. The vocabulary has changed, of course, from one period to another, just like language in English or whatever language is your main language has changed. The basic vocabulary, however, is that of the Bible. But it's very probable that the Bible does not contain all of the vocabulary in actual use in biblical times. In other words, if you know all the words that occurred in the Hebrew Old Testament scriptures, all 39 books, that doesn't mean that you would have known every word that a Hebrew would have known. We have found other Hebrew words that didn't occur in the Bible itself, indicated by archaeological texts uncovered since the beginning of this century. All right, now let's go back to the chart again and look at the eastern side of the Semitic languages. As we mentioned, this is Akkadian, a common name that's given to Babylonian and Assyrian languages. Akkadian was the original name used by the Mesopotamians for their own language. Akkad was the chief city of the first Semitic Empire in Mesopotamia, about 2300 BC. It is also mentioned in the Bible in Genesis 10 and verse 10. Before 4000 BC, Mesopotamia was already inhabited by the Sumerians, a non-Semitic people who had attained a high degree of civilization. The Babylonians and the Assyrians adopted the cuneiform writing of the Sumerians for their own Semitic speech. Akkadian was superseded by Aramaic, by the Aramaic from about the 1st century BC. Now, moving on down, we see Aramaic, and you have the Ethiopic and the Arabic dialects there, and then we drop down and we see the Eastern Aramaic, the Judeo-Babylonian, Syriac, and other dialects. This is a group of dialects first known from inscriptions of the late 10th or early 9th century BC. It is a phenomenal wave of expansion, and Aramaic spread over Palestine and Syria in large tracts of Asia and Egypt, replacing many languages, including Hebrew and Akkadian. For about 1,000 years, it served as the official and written language of the Near East. At the time of Jesus, the language of Palestine was generally Aramaic, and that is something that we know that Jesus spoke. Hebrew had become the property of the learned, and as I mentioned earlier, those who were wanting to study in the synagogues. The actual words of Jesus, for instance, in Mark 5 and verse 41 or Mark 7 and verse 34, were in Aramaic, and so we know that on a number of times Jesus did speak in Aramaic. And Aramaic has also influenced the writing systems of several languages. And as a matter of fact, Hebrew adopted the Aramaic script. And so the various letters of Hebrew are those which they got from Aramaic. Now, by the time of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, the dispersal of the Jews, Aramaic had entirely replaced Hebrew in Palestine and in neighboring lands. And so that was a very devastating blow to the language of Hebrew when the Romans came and took Jerusalem. A large part of the Talmud, a gigantic post-biblical writing of the rabbis. You may have heard of the Talmud, a multi-volume work that tells us a lot about the thinking and the understanding of the rabbis after the destruction of Jerusalem. There existed also an Aramaic version of the Bible by the 6th century AD, which is also known as the Targum. You may have heard of the Targums. Arabic began to supersede Aramaic by the early Christian fathers. Now, Aramaic was an Eastern dialect with rich theological literature that left by the early Christian fathers, and that was something that they used. But about the middle of the 7th century AD, and virtually replaced them by the 9th and 10th centuries. But some Syriac dialects are still spoken today in isolated patches of Syria and Iraq, and that's a little bit about the history of languages. But we look at Hebrew, we see that it had its low points. We had its time when it struggled a little bit, but fortunately we were able to go back, and Hebrew is now revived, and our study of the Old Testament Hebrew Scriptures has been enhanced and benefited, of course, by the work of many people that wanted to bring this dead language back to life once again. All right, let's begin now and talk about the Hebrew alphabet, the Hebrew language itself. Now, there are, as you can see in your textbook, on page 13, lesson number 2, the Hebrew alphabet. Now, there are 22 consonants in the Hebrew alphabet, and the Hebrews love to do things with their alphabet that oftentimes we don't do in English, but we do on occasion. For example, in Psalm 119, each letter of the alphabet begins a section that has 8 verses in it. Now, if you'll take your English Bible and look to Psalm 119, you'll find that is in fact the case. And so we have 22 sections of 8 verses per section, and each section is begun with a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So verses 1 through 8 is called Aleph. Verses 9 through 16 is called Bet. And that's the way we proceed through Psalm 119. And that's something that the Hebrews love to do with their alphabet. Another example of this is found in the book of Lamentations, where you'll have 22 verses in chapter 1 and 2, for example, and each one of those verses begins with a word that has the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet in it. For example, Lamentations 1 and verse 1 begins with a word that has as its first letter Aleph. Verse 2 has as its first word a word that begins with Bet, and so on down. And that's the sort of things that the Hebrews love to do with their own 22 consonants, their own alphabet. All right, now let's begin to learn the Hebrew alphabet. And as I mentioned before, it's kind of like chicken scratchings to you. It's a little bit unfamiliar. There are not letters that are like English letters, but I'm sure with a little bit of practice, this will become something very familiar to you. All right, the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet is that letter right there, which is called Aleph. Now, Aleph is a word that when we transliterate the word into English, all it has is a rough breathing. Aleph does not have a sound all by itself in English. And you also see that it has a numerical value of 1. This is something that's used in modern Hebrew and not the way the letter Aleph would have been used in biblical times. Also, the second letter is that letter right there that has a star by it, which is called bet. Now I want you to note that we've got two different ones, the one with the star and then the one right below it. The only difference between those two is that one has a little dot in it, and the one right below that does not have a dot, and that particular dot is called a dagesh. And we'll talk a little bit about the dagesh before, but the difference that the letter makes with the dot in the middle and without the dot is it just has a slightly different sound. In this case, the letter with the dagesh in it has a definite B sound. And then without the dagesh, the letter bet has more of a V sound. All right, and that's what you can see right there, a B and a V, depending on whether it has the dot or the dagesh in it. All right, the third letter of the Hebrew alphabet is what's called Gimel. And you can see that this also has a star by it, which shows that it is a letter that can take that dagesh. It is pronounced Gimel, and it has a definite G sound to it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The fourth letter of the Hebrew alphabet is what's called Dalet. Dalet. This has a definite D sound, and as you can see, that also has a star by it, which means that this particular letter can take a dot. But as I'll be discussing in just a minute, even though it can take the dagesh, it's not really going to change our pronunciation of it like the bet and the vet did. All right, so the dalet has a definite D sound. The fifth letter of the Hebrew alphabet is what's called Hey. That should be an easy one to remember. Hey. That's our fifth letter, and it has a definite H sound to it. And by looking at this word, you can see that a pretty simple one to remember. Hey. All right, moving on. The sixth letter of the Hebrew alphabet is pronounced Vav. Vav. And it's basically given two different pronunciations in English. Sometimes certain schools will make this with a V and sometimes with a W. And our pronunciation will be with the V. We'll have, when we come to the Vav, it'll be a V. This may be something that you're a little bit familiar with when you've heard the word Yahweh or Yahweh that has this particular letter in it. And so if some people say Yahweh and some say Yahweh, that's because of the Vav, and they're pronouncing it either with a V or a W. The seventh letter in the Hebrew alphabet is what's called Zayin. Zayin. Now you look at that and you can see that it's slightly different than the letter right above it, the Vav, and so with a little bit of practice. The Zayin has a definite Z sound to it, and so that's another one that is fairly easy to remember and pronounce, Zayin. The eighth letter in the Hebrew alphabet is called Heth. Heth. Now, this is a letter that has a real hard H sound to it. As a matter of fact, it's more like a kind of sound, like you're trying to clear in your throat. And so if you get ready to clear your throat, you're making a sound just like the Hebrew Heth. And that's kind of the way that particular word sounds. So it's a very hard H sound. The next letter is Tet. And that is kind of like a funny looking heart, is the way that particular letter looks, and it has a definite T sound to it. So we get to that word or that letter, and it has kind of a hard T. Tet. All right, the 10th letter in the Hebrew alphabet is Yod. This is a definite Y sound. It is the smallest of the Hebrew alphabet, and you may have heard about the Yod, the small letter, and that's what we're looking at right there. Definite Y sound. This is the first letter in Jehovah's name in the Old Testament. Yah, the Yah begins with this letter right here, Yod. All right, the 11th letter also has a star by it, which means it's one of those that can take a dagesh, and this is pronounced Kaf. Cough, just like when you got a cold and you're you're coughing. That's the way that's pronounced, cough. And it has a definite K sound. And for our purposes, we're not going to distinguish too much between cough with a dagesh or a dot and one without it. It's going to be pretty much a K sound. All right, the 12th letter of the Hebrew alphabet is what's called lamed. Lamed. It's a definite L sound, lamed. And we see this particular word, and there's nothing unusual about it as far as the English. It has a definite L. And then the 13th letter is what's called mem. Mem, M-E-M, and has, once again, a definite M sound. All right, now, when we talk about these first 13, we're not finished the alphabet, but we've got, in order, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zion, Het, Tet, Yod, Kaf, Lamed, Mem. All right, those are the first 13 that we talked about. Now let's proceed. And if you need to rewind the tape and go back through those first 13, then this would be a good time to do that before we proceed on. But now let's go ahead and look at the 14th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And this is a letter that looks like that. And it's pronounced noon. Noon, like the noonday sun. Noon has a transliteration of a definite N sound. All right, and then the 15th letter, the Hebrew alphabet, is a little bit kind of like a backward Greek sigma. You're just going the wrong way with it here. And it's pronounced Samic. Samic, and it has a definite S sound in English. Samic. Right below the Samic is what's called an ayin. Ayin. And the ayin is like the aleph in that it does not have a definite sound when we pronounce it. We'll be pronouncing the vowel that goes along with this letter, but it's transliterated with a rough breathing. The aleph gets the smooth breathing. The ayin gets the rough breathing. And then the letter after ayin is pronounced pei. Pei. Now, once again, this has a star by it. And you can see that the first one does have a little dot in it. And when that happens, it has a definite P sound. But if the pei does not have a dot or a dagesh in it, it has an F sound. So those are two different ways that that particular letter will be pronounced, depending upon whether it has the dagesh in it. And then the 18th letter of the Hebrew alphabet is called a sadi. Sadi. This has an S sound, and while you're taking notes on these various letters, you might want to say that this kind of has a TZ sound to it when we translate it, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but that's Sadi. All right, and then this next one, which looks like an English P, is actually the Hebrew Kof. Now, we had a Kaf earlier. Now, this is a Kof here. So pronounced very similar, but Kaf, and this is a Kof. This has a definite Q sound to it, and we'll, of course, be talking about that a little bit later. And then the 20th letter of the Hebrew alphabet is called a Resh. Resh. This has a definite R sound in English. So when we see the Hebrew Resh, we'll know we're looking at an R letter. The 21st letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Now what I want you to notice in this W-looking type letter is there's a dot on the left side and a dot on the right side and the one right below that. Otherwise, they're exactly the same. Well, that dot tells us whether it is going to be pronounced with a simple S or whether it's going to have an SH sound. Now, that's something that you've got to with practice, make sure that you look at. Is the dot on the little left arm of the W-looking letter, or is it on the right? If it's on the left, then it's a seen. If it's on the right arm of the letter, then it's a sheen. But that's what we're going to be calling this letter, the sheen. More often than not, this letter will have an SH sound. Sheen. All right, and then the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet is also one that can take the dagesh. As you can see, it's got a star by it, even though we don't have an example on the screen of the letter without the dagesh. But this is called a tav. A tav, and it has a definite T sound. Or with the dagesh, sometimes it's a definite T with the dagesh and a sort of a TH without the dagesh. All right, those 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And I recognize that these are new things to you, and with time it's going to come along where you're very comfortable with the Hebrew alphabet. And we'll practice on that in just a few minutes. But I want you to note that each sign of the alphabet is also the initial letter of the corresponding Hebrew name. Thus, for example, the fourth letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Dalet, is also tells you that it has a D sound. And so when you learn what the name of these words are, that also helps you understand how it's pronounced in English. All right, so we have Aleph, Bet, that's B. Gimel, that's G. Dalet, that's D. And so on. And so you learn what these letters are called. You also, by the process of learning what these letters are called, also learn how these letters are to be pronounced. Now, if you've studied Greek and you've wrestled with the difference between the uppercase and the lowercase letters, and sometimes those are very different and difficult to remember and understand, forget all that in Hebrew. Hebrew has no capital letters. All the letters are written exactly the same, and that is in what we are going to be learning, a box script. The printed forms are sometimes known as a square or a box script. Students interested in biblical Hebrew are going to be learning in this class. We'll be learning this square script. Each letter of the alphabet, whether printed or written, stands alone. Unlike English or Arabic writing, no letters of the Hebrew alphabet are ever joined together. All right, so we don't do that. We write each letter separately and distinctly. And then there are 6 consonants which are conveniently pronounced begad kafat, and I'll talk about that in just a minute, that may be used with or without a dot. All right, let's go to the chalkboard here, and I'll talk about, show you what I'm talking about. The Hebrew letter bet is one, and then we've got the Hebrew letter gimel, dalet, kov, pei, and tav. All right, these 6 letters, and if we read it this way, that has a B, G, D, K, F, and T. Those are the corresponding English letters, but let's make a word of it. Let's make it B, God, Kifat. How about like that? Begad Kifat. And if you can remember Begad Kifat, then you'll remember that these 6 letters can all take a dagesh. Now, what's a dagesh? Remember, a dagesh is that letter, that dot that can go in the letter. So this particular letter right here, the bet, can have a dagesh or may not have a dagesh, and of course that's going to depend on it. But you can remember what 6 letters can do this by remembering these 6 letters and the begad kafat. Now, the only ones for our purposes that are going to have a different pronunciation will be this one, the base. And if it has the dagesh, it has a definite B sound. If the base does not have a dagesh, then it's going to have a V. And then the other one will be the pei. If it has a dagesh, then it has a definite P sound. If it does not have a dagesh, then it has an F sound. And other than that, those are going to be the only letters that we're going to worry about. And so if you see this letter, or this letter without a dot in it, then don't worry about trying to pronounce that differently. All right, now, there are 5 letters that have a different form when they occur at the end of a word. Now, remember that. When they occur at the end of a word. And these letters are the kaf, the mem, the noon, the pei, and the sadi. Now, we look at these 5 letters. If they occur at the end of the word, then this is the way they're going to look. And I'll just put little arrows down here. The kaf is going to be written like this if it ends a word. If it's in the middle of a word, it'll look like this. If it's at the end of the word, then it's going to look like this. The mem, when it ends a word, is just a box, like that. The noon, when it ends a word, is going to extend down below the line. This one would extend below the line too. Let's say on the page we're looking at like this. The difference between this and this is that it comes out a little bit and extends below the line. The noon will have a little thing on the top there, and it will also extend below the line. And then pei will extend below the line like that when it ends a word. And then a backward Y is what the sadi is going to look like when it ends. All right, so here we have 5 different Hebrew letters that take a different form when they end the word. When they're in the middle of the word, at the beginning of the word, their normal form is what they're going to take. But when they end a word, then it's going to be the final form. All right, now, you understand, of course, the Hebrew is one that is read and written from right to left. English, of course, goes from left to right. And so you need to be familiarizing yourself with writing this way and reading, of course, Hebrew. That's the only way you're going to be able to read it, from right to left. Now, we talked a little bit about that each letter has a numerical value, but we're not concerned about the numerical value. That usage is not biblical, and that's the reason that we're not concerned with that. Because when we read in the Scriptures, we will not see these things happening in the Hebrew Old Testament. All right, let's go briefly to the exercises that you have in your book. This is on page number 16. And exercise number A has there identify the following letters by name and transliterate into the Roman or the English alphabet. Remember to read Hebrew from right to left, and that's what we're going to be doing. All right, let's look at those first letters, and I'll just go through the letters and pronounce those and see if with practice you know what letters we're looking at. All right, I'm starting from the right, going to the left. We got the Heth, Ayin, Lamed, Yod, Vav, Teth, Kof, Bet, Shin, Gimel. Second line, Sadi, Dalet, Hey, Aleph, Ayin, Shin, Dalet, Kaf, Nun, Mem. Third line, Pei, Kaf, Mem, Pei, that's the ending Pei, Samik, Nun, that's the ending Nun, Pei, Sadi, that is the ending Sadi, Resh, and then Dalet. No, excuse me, that's the ending Kaf. All right, and then dropping down to B, we have basically the same things, and so give the names of the letters contained in the following words and their corresponding English sounds. Having gone through that first section, you should be able to do that. But let's go through briefly the first line only and give the corresponding English sounds. Starting from right to left, top line, you've got a resh that has an R sound. Aleph, which has no sound. The Zion, which has a Z or a TZ sound. The Base, which has a B sound if it has a dot in it, and this one doesn't, so it would have a V sound. And then the last letter there is the ending Nun, so it has an N sound. All right, that's probably enough of that. We can you can kind of see what sort of exercise you need to do on that particular page. All right, as you go through and you look at the remaining exercises, there are some letters to transliterate, and you go back to the chart on the alphabet. You saw that they showed you how to transliterate those letters, and that's what you need to do. All right, that concludes our lesson number 2. Learning the Hebrew alphabet. Please do not proceed until you're very familiar with the Hebrew alphabet.